Lean in close, because what you're about to hear is a secret the richest man in the city never wanted told. Imagine a house so grand it brushes the clouds, yet so lonely it scares away every soul who steps inside. For years, no maid lasted more than 2 days, until a barefoot village girl with only a single candle and a brave little heart walked through the gate. Tonight, seat back, relax, and let the world slow down for a while. Let the fire crackle, the tea steam, and the room grow quiet. Because this is not just another story. This is the night the house finally learned to sing. Stay with me till the very last word, because the ending will wrap around you like a warm blanket and leave you smiling long after the screen goes dark. Ready? Deep breath, and let's begin. On the far edge of the bustling city, beyond markets filled with chatter and music, there stood a house so large it seemed to brush the clouds. Its roof glimmered in the sun like a crown, and its windows shone like watchful eyes. To some it was a marvel, a palace of gold and stone. But to most, it was a place of unease. For all its wealth and grandeur, the house was terribly, achingly lonely. The path to the house wound upward like a snake, cobbled with old stones cracked by weeds. By day, birds circled above it, but rarely landed on its roof. By night, its silhouette against the moon looked like a sleeping giant, silent and dark. Children whispered that if you dared stand at its gates too long, the air would press against you, heavy as water, until you could hardly breathe. For years, the people in the city told stories. Some said the house was cursed, that shadows walked its halls after midnight. Some swore they heard faint music drifting down the hill on windless nights, music that vanished the moment you listened closely. Others told of cries, sharp, echoing cries, that pierced the stillness before dawn, like the house itself was weeping. But the strangest part of all was not the sound, nor the sight, nor even the feel of the place. It was what happened to the people who tried to work there. The richest man in the city, Mr. Gold, had built the mansion with his fortune. He had filled it with treasures from faraway lands, marble staircases, mirrors taller than 2 men, chandeliers that glittered with crystals, carpets woven with silken threads. Servants were hired often, for a house so large required many hands. No matter how fine the pay, no maid or cook or guard lasted more than 2 days. The first night always seemed calm. They would unpack their things, marvel at the grand halls, and feel the promise of riches. But by the second night, something always changed. Some claimed the mirrors whispered their names. Some swore footsteps followed them, though no one was there. Some said the candles blew themselves out, leaving them in choking darkness, and every single one, without fail, left before the third dawn. The city began to whisper. The house is alive, they said. The house is hungry. And Mr. Gold, though rich beyond measure, grew more and more alone. He had no wife, no children, no laughter echoing in his halls. He sat at long tables set for 20 and dined in silence. He walked corridors lined with portraits but never spoke to a soul. His fortune bought him every treasure except the one thing he needed most: warmth. And so the house stood on its hill, beautiful and dreadful, waiting. Seasons passed, the gardens grew wild, roses twisting into thorny cages, ivy crawling across the gates. Dust lay thick upon golden frames, windows fogged with neglect. The richer the man grew, the emptier his heart and home became. Travellers sometimes passed the gates on their way to the city. They would stop and stare. How strange, they thought, that a house so grand should feel so hollow. Some felt a tug in their chest, as though the house itself was calling to them. Others hurried past, unwilling to look too long. But no matter how many turned away, the house remained. A silent sentinel on the hill, cloaked in secrets, heavy with echoes, waiting for someone who would not run, waiting for someone whose light could survive its shadows. The city children dared each other to run to the gates at dusk and touch the iron bars. They would scream and laugh, then flee down the hill with pounding hearts. Old women shook their heads and warned them not to tempt fate. Merchants crossed themselves when they caught sight of its highest window, where a pale curtain sometimes moved, though no hand was near it. Yet, in all its years of loneliness, in all its decades of silence, the house had never known what was coming. For far away in a village where the roofs were patched with straw and the nights smelled of firewood, a barefoot girl was growing up. She had little to her name, but a brave heart and a candle stub saved from a festival. She did not yet know of the house, or of Mr. Gold, or of the whispers that wrapped around the hill like fog. But soon she would. And the night she crossed its gate, the night she carried her tiny flame into its endless dark, would be the night everything began to change. The house, the man, the city itself, none of them knew it yet. But a story was stirring, like a bird ruffling its wings before flight. This is where it begins. The house on the hill had many secrets, but none more talked about than the strange fate of those who tried to serve within its walls. For every month that passed, Mr. Gold would send word to the city that he needed new hands to tend the mansion. The wages he offered were enough to tempt the poorest labourer or the bravest servant. Gold coins, more than most would see in years, stacked in a purse heavy enough to make the fingers ache. The promise was irresistible, and so they came, one after another. The first was a woman named Clara. She was tall, proud, and certain no ghost could frighten her. She walked into the mansion with her head high and her boots clicking across the marble floor. The house seemed to welcome her at first, its grand halls gleaming in candlelight. She polished the banisters, swept the carpets, and laughed at the warnings she had heard. But on her second night, as the clock struck midnight, she heard footsteps above her chamber. Heavy steps, steady and slow, pacing back and forth. She climbed the stairs to find the source, yet every room she opened was empty. Still, the footsteps followed. They seemed to move just beyond the door she had not yet opened, always one step ahead. By dawn, Clara fled, leaving her bag and boots behind, running barefoot into the city. She never returned. The next was Marta, a young girl from the outskirts of town, full of songs and chatter. She sang as she worked, filling the halls with a sweetness long missing. But as she scrubbed the mirrors in the east wing, her song was cut short. Her reflection did not move when she did. It lingered, smiling faintly, even when Marta's own mouth had fallen silent. She stared, frozen with fear, as her reflected hand lifted without her own. When she turned to run, the reflection laughed softly, though no sound came from her own lips. Marta left her bucket and rag on the floor and never looked back. Then came old Thomas, a cook with hands calloused from years of kneading bread. He was hired to prepare meals for Mr. Gold, who dined alone. Thomas thought nothing of strange tales. He believed only in fire, flour, and salt. But on his second evening, as he lit the ovens, the fire sputtered and roared without wood. Faces seemed to appear in the flames, whispering in voices too soft to catch. His stews turned bitter, though he used the finest herbs, and his bread burned, though the coals were pale. When he tasted a spoonful of soup, he swore it whispered his name on his tongue. Thomas bolted from the kitchen, apron still tied around his waist, and never set foot in the mansion again. There was also Elise, who loved nothing more than to dust and tidy. She was quick with her hands and quicker with her smile. On her second night, she discovered a locked door beneath the grand staircase. A faint light leaked from its cracks. Curious, she bent down, pressing her ear against the wood. She heard a low hum, like someone singing from far underground. She fetched a key, turned it slowly, and pushed the door open. What she saw inside she never spoke of. But those who passed her on the road that morning swore her eyes had gone pale, as though she had left more than her belongings behind. One by one, they came, and one by one, they fled. Some swore the house watched them sleep. Some whispered that the painting's eyes followed them down the hall. Others claimed the chandeliers swayed, though no wind stirred. In the city, the stories grew wild. Children repeated them in hushed voices by the fire. Merchants shook their heads and muttered that no coin was worth such terror. Yet still, desperate souls tried, lured by the heavy purse of gold Mr. Gold offered. Not one of them lasted. Mr. Gold himself paid little attention to the tales. He saw only the failures, never the reasons. Each time a servant fled, he grew angrier, his heart heavier. He scolded them as cowards, blind to the truth that it was not weakness that drove them away, but something deeper, something the house itself breathed into its halls. The house was no mere building of stone and wood. It was alive in a way no one could explain. It tested those who entered. It whispered to them in voices from long ago. It mirrored the emptiness of its master's soul, and in doing so, it drove away all who could not bear to face their own shadows. And so the cycle repeated. Servants hired, servants gone, doors shut, curtains drawn, silence pressing once more against the golden halls. The city began to speak less of the riches Mr. Gold offered and more of the curse he could not escape. Some claimed the house demanded loneliness, that it would allow no other presence but his. Others said it was waiting for someone worthy, someone whose light could endure its darkness. Years passed and the mansion grew more desolate. Dust lay thick as snow on the staircases. Curtains rotted at their hems. The gardens tangled into wild jungles of thorn and vine. Yet always the house stood, looming above the city, watching, waiting. No one dared enter now. No one, save for one who was yet to arrive. For far away, in that small village where fields shimmered with wheat and nights hummed with crickets, a girl was gathering courage she did not yet know she possessed. She had heard whispers of the house on the hill. She had heard tales of servants who never returned. But unlike the others, her heart did not tremble. Instead, it burned brighter, like the small candle she carried, steady even in the wind. The maids had run, the cooks had fled, the strong and the stubborn had all been driven out. But the girl was coming, and the house, in its endless waiting, shivered with something it had not felt in many years. Hope. In a small village, far from the tall stone walls of the city, there lived a barefoot girl named Laya. Her home was a cottage patched with clay and straw, its roof slanted like a crooked smile. Her bed was a bundle of hay, her meals were bowls of porridge, and her only treasures were a wooden spoon, a worn shawl, and a stub of candle she had saved from the last festival of light. Laya was not rich, nor was she powerful, but she had something that no gold could buy. She had a heart that did not bend easily. When storms tore at the roof, she held it down with her bare hands. When fields turned dry, she carried water from the stream until her shoulders ached. When neighbours quarrelled, she stepped between them with a smile, softening anger into laughter. The people of her village said she was too fearless for her own good. Yet when the nights grew long and dark, it was her candle they gathered around, watching the little flame dance, while Laya told stories that made even the weary smile. One morning, as she walked to the stream with her pail, she overheard travellers on the road whispering about the mansion on the hill. They spoke of Mr. Gold, rich and alone, who could not keep a servant. They spoke of footsteps in the night, of mirrors that grinned, of shadows that breathed. The villagers who listened shuddered and hurried on, but Laya did not. She stopped, holding her pail still, her eyes bright. A house so grand it brushed the clouds, a house where no one could last. To Laya, it did not sound like a curse. It sounded like a challenge. That night, she lay awake, staring at her candle. Its flame flickered softly, and she whispered to it in her heart. If no one else would dare, then perhaps she must. For she believed deeply that no place, no matter how dark, was beyond the reach of a little light. So at dawn, she tied her shawl tight, tucked the stub of her candle into her pocket, and set out on the long road to the city. The journey was not easy. The road twisted through forests where owls watched from the branches. It crossed fields of tall grass that hissed with the wind. It climbed hills that left her breathless, and it dipped into valleys where fog pooled like milk. But Laya walked steadily, her bare feet toughened by years of paths. Whenever fear tried to creep into her chest, she touched the candle in her pocket and reminded herself that even the smallest flame can scatter the deepest dark. When at last the city gates rose before her, she stared in awe. Towers and rooftops stretched high, chimneys smoked, and markets bustled with voices. She asked about Mr. Gold's mansion, and the people frowned. Some laughed bitterly, saying no one dared go near. Others warned her that the house swallowed those who entered. But Laya only thanked them, adjusted her shawl, and began the climb. The path to the mansion was long and winding. Stones cracked beneath her feet and weeds clawed at her ankles. The iron gates loomed tall, tangled with ivy and thorns. She stood before them, breathing hard, staring at the house that brushed the sky. It was magnificent, but not in the way of beauty. Its towers were sharp as teeth, its windows dark as hollow eyes. Curtains fluttered though the air was still. A heavy silence pressed against her, so thick it seemed to hum. Most would have turned back at the gate. Most would have run. But Laya was not most. She placed a hand on the cold iron bars. The chill ran up her arm, but she did not flinch. She pushed, and the gates groaned open, their hinges crying like old throats. With each step she took inside, the air seemed to tighten around her, as though the house itself were holding its breath. She crossed the overgrown garden, brushing past roses that curled like claws. She climbed the cracked steps, their marble chipped and worn. At last she stood before the tall wooden doors, carved with patterns of vines and suns that had long faded. For a moment she paused. She felt the weight of every story she had heard pressing upon her shoulders. She thought of Clara with the footsteps, Marta with the mirrors, Tomas with the fire, Elise with the door. But then she touched her pocket, felt the stub of her candle, and lifted her chin. She knocked. The sound echoed through the halls beyond, rolling like thunder. Slowly the doors opened, not by any hand, but as if the house itself had decided to let her in. The air inside was cool, heavy with dust and silence. A chandelier glittered faintly above, though no candles burned in it. The marble floor stretched wide, polished in patches where footsteps once walked, dulled in corners where shadows pooled. Grand staircases curved upward, splitting left and right, their railings draped in cobwebs. Lila stepped inside. Her bare feet made no sound, yet she felt as though the house heard her anyway. She could almost sense it leaning closer, curious. At that moment, something strange happened. A draught swept through the hall, though no windows were open. The doors behind her creaked shut with a slow final groan. Lila did not turn back. She stood tall, one hand still in her pocket, fingers curled around her candle. The house had seen many enter and many flee, but this one was different. She did not tremble. She did not dart her eyes to every corner. She stood in the silence as if it were her own. High above, unseen in a shadowed room, Mr. Gold sat at his long dining table. He lifted his head at the sound of the doors closing. His servants had all fled. His halls had grown too quiet. But now something had changed. For the first time in years, someone had walked willingly into his home, and far deeper still, in the hidden heart of the house, something stirred. A whisper, a hum, like the faintest breath of a song. The girl with the candle had arrived, and nothing would ever be the same again. The doors had closed behind Lila, but she did not turn back. She stood in the grand hall, her eyes adjusting to the dim light, her hand resting on the stub of her candle. She could feel the house watching her, its silence heavy, its shadows thick as velvet. She took her first steps deeper inside, each one echoing faintly as though the marble floor itself remembered the weight of every visitor before her. Dust drifted lazily in the air, stirred by her movement, catching the faint glow that leaked from cracks in the ceiling. The walls rose high, hung with portraits whose painted eyes followed her. She studied them carefully. Men and women with solemn faces, dressed in finery, all staring out as though frozen mid-thought. Their colours had faded, yet their expressions remained sharp, almost alive. Lila slowed at one portrait in particular, a woman with hair like spun gold and eyes soft as morning light. Unlike the others, her gaze did not seem stern but sorrowful, as though she longed to speak but could not. Lila tilted her head, whispering softly in her heart that she would not forget the woman's face. The air grew colder as she moved on. She passed through tall arches into a long corridor where mirrors lined the walls, cracked in places, spotted in others, yet still reflective. She remembered Marta's tale of the smile that was not her own. Her stomach tightened, but she forced herself to look. Her reflection stared back, a small barefoot girl with tangled hair and a shawl too thin for the chill. She lifted her hand, and her reflection lifted too, perfectly in time. She took a step, and so did it. Nothing unusual. Yet she noticed something unsettling. The reflections of the hall itself did not quite match. In one mirror, a chandelier still gleamed, though the real one hung unlit. In another, a carpet stretched red and lush, though beneath her feet lay only faded rags. The mirrors remembered the mansion as it once had been, and they showed her not only herself, but the house's forgotten splendour. A draught swept past her, carrying with it a whisper. At first she thought it was only the sigh of wind through broken glass, but then she heard it again, faint and drawn out, like a voice calling her name from very far away. Lila. She froze. Her heart pounded, her fingers curling tighter around the candle in her pocket. The voice was soft, almost tender, but it was impossible. No one here knew her name. She did not run. Instead, she pressed onward, following the corridor until it opened into a vast dining hall. The ceiling soared above her, painted once with grand murals of suns and stars, though time had peeled them away. A long table stretched across the room, its wood polished yet bare, save for a single golden plate at its head. And there, seated in the tall chair, was Mr. Gold. He was not as Lila had imagined. She had expected a man tall and cruel, weighed down by arrogance. Instead, she saw someone thinner, older, his shoulders bent with years of solitude. His clothes were fine, embroidered with threads of silver, yet they hung loosely on his frame. His hair was black, touched with grey, his eyes deep and dark, like wells that had not seen light in too long. For a long moment he said nothing, only studied her with a mixture of curiosity and disbelief. Then, in a voice that cracked from disuse, he asked why she had come. Lila lifted her chin. She told him she had heard the stories, that no one lasted in his house, that the walls drove all away. But she had come not for his gold nor his promise of wages. She had come to see if the darkness could truly be stronger than light. Mr. Gold's lips curved into something between a smile and a grimace. "Foolish child," he murmured. "Do you not fear what you cannot see? Do you not tremble at what you cannot understand?" Lila reached into her pocket and drew out the candle. The stub was small, its wick blackened from past use. She held it up, steady, and answered that even the smallest flame was braver than the deepest shadow. Something shifted in the air. The room seemed to grow restless, the chandelier above swaying though no wind stirred. The golden plate rang faintly, as though touched by an invisible hand. Mr. Gold's eyes narrowed, not in anger but in unease. For many had entered his house boasting strength, and all had fled. None had stood before him with such quiet defiance, armed with nothing more than a candle. Before he could speak again, a noise rose from the far corner of the hall. A door creaked open, though no hand touched it. Darkness spilled from within, thicker than ink, sliding across the floor like smoke. Lila stepped forward instinctively, candle clutched in her fist. Mr. Gold's chair scraped against the floor as he stood, his face pale. He told her to stay back, that the house did not forgive trespass. But Lila's eyes shone with steady fire. She said softly that perhaps the house was not angry, but lonely. That perhaps all it needed was someone who did not fear its shadows. The darkness stirred as if listening. It swirled and retreated slowly into the doorway, leaving the air still once more. Mr. Gold stared at her, bewildered. In that moment, something broke in him, though he did not understand it yet. For the first time, he wondered if his house did not curse him, but mirror him. If its emptiness was not its own, but born of his own hollow heart. He sank back into his chair, silent. And Lila, barefoot and small, stood in the centre of the vast room, holding her candle as though it were a torch powerful enough to change the world. The house had shown her its shadows, but she had not run, and in return it had whispered her name. The night deepened around the mansion, but inside, time seemed to move differently. The silence was no longer empty. It was watchful, waiting. Lila stood in the dining hall, her candle stub warm in her hand, while Mr. Gold sat slumped in his chair, staring at her as though he could not quite believe she was real. The shadows in the far corners no longer pressed so heavily. They lingered, but softer, as though listening. It was as if the house itself leaned closer, curious about this barefoot girl who dared to speak of loneliness instead of curses. Lila turned slowly, taking in the vast room. Her eyes rested on the murals above. Faded suns and peeling stars. She could almost imagine them once gleaming bright, painted with hope and pride. The long table stretched before her like a memory of feasts long past, its polished wood aching for laughter, for clattering dishes, for voices sharing bread. She asked quietly if the house had always been this silent. Mr. Gold did not answer at once. His fingers traced the edge of the golden plate before him, his gaze fixed on nothing. Finally, he said that once the house had been alive with sound, music spilling from the ballroom, bells ringing from the towers, kitchens clattering with pots and pans. Servants hurried through halls, children played on staircases, voices filled the air until even the walls seemed to hum with joy. But joy is fragile. One by one the voices faded. Friends left, family drifted away, laughter grew scarce. When at last his wife, the woman with hair like sunlight, was gone, the silence became unbearable. And in that silence, something else took root. Shadows thickened, mirrors warped, doors whispered. The house began to echo not with life, but with the emptiness inside his own heart. Lila listened quietly, her eyes soft. She did not interrupt, though each word dripped heavy with sorrow. When he fell silent, she stepped closer and placed her candle stub on the table, its wax rough against the polished wood. She said that perhaps the house was only remembering him too well, that it carried his grief in its walls just as surely as it carried the music and laughter it once knew. Her words, the chandelier above gave a faint shiver, and for a moment a single crystal caught light, though no flame burned. Mr. Gold frowned, uneasy. He muttered that no one should dare to claim the house remembered. But Lila's gaze did not waver. She told him gently that buildings have hearts too, not hearts of flesh, but hearts of memory. And when no one tends those memories, they grow restless, twisting into shadows. As she spoke, the mirrors in the corridor outside began to flicker faintly. Not with her reflection, but with glimpses of children running, maids laughing, candles glowing bright. The house was listening, and it was remembering. The faint hum she had heard when she first entered now returned, deeper and clearer, like the first breath of a song struggling to rise after years of silence. Mr. Gold's face paled. He pressed a hand to his chest as if something stirred there too. His voice shook as he asked how she could speak so boldly, unafraid of the very darkness that had driven everyone else away. Lila lifted the candle again. She said she had grown up in a village where winters were long and cruel. Some nights, the cold was so sharp it stole the breath from her lungs. But she had learned that one flame, even the smallest, was enough to keep fear from devouring the heart. She had carried her candle through storms, through hunger, through quarrels, through sorrow, and always it had reminded her, no night lasts forever. Her words seemed to ripple outward, and the mansion rippled with them. Dust drifted from beams high above, as though shaken loose by an invisible tremor. Curtains stirred without wind. The golden plate before Mr. Gold gleamed faintly, not with firelight, but with memory. The house was remembering. Lila turned toward the corridor of mirrors. Slowly, she walked back into it, Mr. Gold trailing behind her like a shadow reluctant to follow. The mirrors shimmered as she passed. In one, the ballroom blazed with light, musicians playing violins while dancers spun in gowns of silk. In another, the kitchen bustled, servants kneading bread, roasting meat, carrying trays with joy. In yet another, a woman with hair of spun gold leaned over a balcony, laughing as a man below blew kisses to her. Mr. Gold stopped, his knees trembling. He saw his wife's reflection as though she stood before him once more. He reached for the mirror, his hand trembling, but his fingers touched only cold glass. The vision rippled, then faded, leaving his own weary reflection staring back. His lips parted, but no words came. Only a single tear traced down his cheek, shining faintly before vanishing into his beard. Lila placed her small hand against the mirror beside his, not touching him, but standing beside him nonetheless. She whispered softly that the house did not hate him. It only grieved with him. It remembered what he had lost because he could not bear to let it go. For a long time, Mr. Gold stood in silence, his hand pressed against the mirror, his eyes closed. The house seemed to hold its breath with him. Then, faintly, a sound stirred. It was not the moan of pipes or the groan of wood. It was a note so fragile it might have been imagined, a single thread of music drifting like smoke through the air. The house had begun to sing. It was not yet clear, not yet strong, but it was there. A beginning. Lila closed her hand around her candle and smiled softly. She whispered that perhaps the house would not stop singing until it had remembered every joy it had once known. Mr. Gold, still trembling, sank to a chair in the hall. His face was pale, but for the first time in years his eyes shone with something other than sorrow. He asked in a hoarse voice if the house could ever forgive him, if the memories could ever turn from shadows back into light. Lila's smile was steady. She told him forgiveness was not something the house must give. It was something he must allow himself to feel. Outside, the wind shifted. Somewhere in the depths of the mansion, a locked door clicked softly, as though opening for the first time in years. The house remembered, and it was ready to remember more. From the moment the locked door deep within its belly clicked open. Something unseen moved through its bones like blood returning to a sleeping heart. The walls, long heavy with silence, quivered faintly as if stretching after centuries of slumber. Dust shifted from beams, mirrors brightened for fleeting moments, and the air thickened with the faintest hum of music. Lila stood in the hall, her candle raised. Mr. Gold remained seated, staring at her as though she were a vision conjured by grief and hope woven together. His hands trembled on the table's edge, and his lips whispered words not meant for her, but for the woman he had once loved. Words of longing, words of apology, words that had been locked in his chest so long they barely had shape anymore. The house seemed to hear him. The shadows swirled like listeners gathering close, not to frighten, but to witness. For years they had feasted only on his sorrow, but now something new was being offered: remembrance, truth, and the fragile seed of forgiveness. Lila stepped closer to the open corridor where the whispering music was swelling. She urged Mr. Gold to follow. He rose slowly, his frame bent not only with age, but with the weight of years spent alone, years spent locking himself inside a fortress of his own sorrow. Together, the two figures, one barefoot child, one moved through the labyrinth of corridors. The sound grew stronger as they walked. It was not the grand booming of organs nor the crisp trills of violins, but something simpler, humming. As if the walls themselves remembered lullabies sung to children who once ran through them, remembered the hum of women weaving cloth, remembered the low chants of men returning from work, grateful to rest. It was the music of life, ordinary and beautiful. They reached the ballroom, its vast double doors ajar. A golden glow spilled from within, though no lamp was lit. Lila pushed gently, and the doors creaked wide. Inside, the room had awakened. The cracked marble floor gleamed faintly, reflections of light playing across it, though no torches burned. The tall windows were still draped in cobwebs, but through the glass poured a moon so bright it was as though the heavens themselves leaned close to watch. And there, in the very centre, the air shimmered. At first, it was only shapes of light. Then, slowly, figures began to take form. Shadows of the past, memories so strong they were almost flesh. Couples twirling in gowns and coats, musicians raising bows to strings, laughter caught in motion. Ghosts of joy, but not to frighten, only to remind. Mr. Gold's breath caught. He saw himself younger, stronger, holding the hand of the woman with hair like spun gold. She laughed as he spun her, her gown catching the light, her smile brighter than the chandelier overhead. His knees buckled and he nearly fell, but Lila steadied him with her small hand. "Do not be afraid," she whispered. "They are not here to haunt you. They are here to show you what was never truly lost." The music swelled until it filled every corner. The walls vibrated faintly. The chandeliers tinkled softly, as though touched by invisible fingers. The house was singing at last, and its song was not one of grief, but of memory and love. Tears streamed down Mr. Gold's face. He stepped forward into the ballroom, his hands outstretched as though to touch the spectre of his wife. For a moment her eyes met his, shimmering pools of light and warmth. She lifted her hand, and though he knew it was only a memory, he pressed his palm against the air, desperate to feel her once more. Lila watched in silence, her candle glowing steady. She did not interrupt. This was not her moment, but his. The house had been waiting for him to remember without fear, to weep without shame. And now at last he did. The woman's figure leaned close, her lips moving without sound. Yet Mr. Gold heard her as clearly as if she whispered into his ear. She forgave him. She loved him still. And though she could not stay, she would always remain in the memory of the house and in the song it now carried. The figure dissolved into light, but the music did not fade. Instead, it grew richer, as though the house itself had absorbed her voice, weaving it into its everlasting hum. Mr. Gold fell to his knees, his sobs echoing not in emptiness, but blending with the song. His grief was still there, but softened, wrapped in warmth instead of ice. Lila stepped forward and placed her candle at the centre of the ballroom floor. Its small flame flickered, and in that moment it seemed to join the moonlight and the shimmering visions until the entire room glowed. She whispered softly, more to the house than to the man beside her, "No night lasts forever." The words carried, the walls trembled faintly, the mirrors flashed with visions of joy, and the doors of the house, locked for so long, gave a final groan and swung wide open. Fresh night air rushed in, carrying the scent of grass, of trees, of earth. The house exhaled as though it had been holding its breath for years. Mr. Gold rose slowly, leaning on the table for strength. His face was wet, his shoulders weary, but his eyes shone with a light no one had seen in years. He turned to Lila and bowed his head, his voice breaking as he thanked her. Not only for staying, not only for her courage, but for giving him back the heart of his home. She smiled, shaking her head. It was not she who had done it, she told him. It was the house itself. All it had needed was someone willing to listen, to believe that its song could still be sung. The ballroom shimmered one last time, the visions fading slowly like morning mist, but the music remained. Not loud, not overbearing, just a constant hum, steady and warm like the heartbeat of the house itself. Mr. Gold reached for the candle, but Lila shook her head. "Leave it here," she whispered. "Let the house keep it, so it never forgets again." And so it was left, a tiny flame flickering at the center of a vast ballroom, holding back the dark, not through power but through faith. That night, for the first time in years, the mansion did not feel lonely. It felt alive. The city below would still whisper of the haunted house that sat atop the hill, but those who passed near would notice something new. At night, faint strains of music drifted from its windows, a hum of warmth, a reminder that shadows can be turned into song. And deep inside, Mr. Gold, no longer the richest man in sorrow, sat with a heart that finally knew peace. The house had learned to sing, and its song would never end. Thank you for listening, dear friend. If you enjoyed this tale, please subscribe to the channel so you will never miss the next adventure waiting just beyond the gate. Until then, rest well, dream sweetly, and we will meet you again in our next video.